12 rifles, 50 feet. 8 o'clock in the morning, December the 1st, 1945, in a stockade outside the Italian town of Aversa. The man standing against the post is 54 years old. He has fought in 2 world wars. He wears the Iron Cross, first and second class, pinned to a uniform that no longer means anything, because in less than a minute he will be dead. His name is Anton Dossler, and 18 months earlier, he sent 2 words down a telegraph wire that would end his life just as surely as they had ended the lives of 15 young Americans he never met. The order was simple: shoot them. What makes Dostler's story different from almost every other Nazi officer executed after the war isn't the crime. It's the excuse. He didn't deny what he did. He simply argued he shouldn't be blamed for it. This is the story of the first man the Allies ever put on trial for a war crime, and the defense that would echo and fail again and again in the year that followed. To understand how a decorated, capable officer ends up facing a firing squad for a war crime, you have to go back more than a decade before that morning in Aversa, to the summer of 1934, when the German military quietly rewrote the terms of its own loyalty. Soldiers no longer swore an oath to the German Constitution, or even to the country itself. They swore unconditional obedience to one man, Adolf Hitler, personally. It sounds like a small change in wording. It wasn't. It was the moment the German officer corps traded its independence for a seat at the table. Not every general in that room believed in Hitler's ideology. Plenty of them found him crude, even embarrassing, a former corporal lecturing career aristocrats on strategy. But belief wasn't the point. Hitler offered something they wanted more: a military rebuilt from the humiliation of Versailles, a war they were promised they'd win against France and against the Soviet Union, and, for the men at the very top, something far more personal: bribes, extra pay, land grants, entire estates handed out to generals who kept quiet and did their jobs. It was less an ideological alliance than a business arrangement, and the German High Command signed on with their eyes open. That arrangement had a price, and the bill came due almost immediately after the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. Behind the advancing German front lines, mobile killing units called the Einsatzgruppen began the systematic murder of Jewish men, women, and children across Eastern Europe. Somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million people executed in forests and ravines and open fields. The German army wasn't a bystander to this. It supplied the trucks, the fuel, the intelligence, sometimes the manpower. Liaison officers filed reports. Nobody up the chain claimed not to know. And when officers did object, it was rarely to the killing itself. It was usually about logistics, about the invasion falling behind schedule. This was the machine Anton Dossler belonged to. Not the SS, not the death camps you've heard about 100 times. The regular army, the Wehrmacht, the institution that spent decades after the war insisting it had simply fought a conventional war and left the atrocities to somebody else. Dostler's career is one of the clearest proofs that story was a lie. Anton Dossler was born on the 10th of May, 1891 in Munich, at a time when Germany was still an empire and the horrors of the century to come were unimaginable. He joined the Bavarian Army's 6th Infantry Regiment as a 19-year-old cadet in 1910, the kind of young man who seemed built for a military career: disciplined, ambitious, unremarkable, in exactly the way that lets a soldier rise quietly through the ranks. 4 years later, the First World War broke out, and Dostler went with it. He was promoted to lieutenant, then to Oberleutnant in 1916, and by October of 1918, weeks before the war's end, he'd made captain. Along the way, he earned the Iron Cross, both classes, and the Bavarian Military Merit Order, the kingdom's highest recognition for bravery. On paper, there's nothing here that separates Dostler from thousands of other competent, courageous German officers who fought honorably in the trenches and came home to a country that had lost everything. That country, the newly formed Weimar Republic, gave Dostler a very different kind of career. Versailles had gutted the German military down to 100,000 men, and the force that remained, the Reichswehr, was more bureaucracy than army. Dostler adapted. In 1924, he moved into military intelligence at the Reichswehr Ministry in Berlin, studied at university on the side, and by 1932 had made major. He was, by every measure available at the time, a serious professional soldier building a serious professional career in an institution that had nothing to do with the Nazi Party, because the Nazi Party didn't exist yet as a governing force. That changed in January of 1933, when Hitler took power. 2 years later, Nazi racial law reached into the military itself. Jewish soldiers were expelled from its ranks. By 1938, Hitler had made himself supreme commander of the entire armed forces, and the transformation was nearly complete. A new generation of soldiers was arriving straight out of the Hitler Youth, indoctrinated before they ever put on a uniform. Officers who might have privately winced at what Germany was becoming had already watched Hitler annex Austria and dismember Czechoslovakia without firing a shot, and then, in the spring of 1940, crush France in 6 weeks. Whatever doubts existed were buried under the sheer, intoxicating success of it all. This is the part of the story that's easy to skip past, and it shouldn't be. Dostler wasn't some fanatic who joined the Nazi cause out of ideological hunger. He was a career officer who built his entire adult life inside an institution, watched that institution get slowly hollowed out and refilled with something monstrous, and made the choice over and over at every promotion, at every new posting, to stay. That choice is what makes what comes next so much harder to explain away. Anton Dossler took command of the 57th Infantry Division on the 26th of September 1941, 3 months into Operation Barbarossa, and, as it turned out, just 3 days before one of the single worst massacres of the entire war. The division was part of Army Group South, the force that had spent the preceding weeks fighting its way toward Kiev, and by the time Dostler took the reins, the city had already fallen. What happened next took place squarely within his zone of responsibility. On the 29th and 30th of September 1941, Alsatian police units, operating with the knowledge of the German military command in the region, marched Kiev's Jewish population to a ravine on the outskirts of the city called Babi Yar. In 2 days, they murdered nearly 34,000 people, men, women, children, the elderly, anyone too weak or too unwilling to run. It remains one of the largest mass shootings at a single site in the history of the war. Dostler had taken command of the division, stationed in that exact theater only 3 days earlier. There's no surviving order that puts a gun in his own hand at Babi Yar, but there's no distance between him and it, either. A general arriving to take command of troops in a city where mass murder was already underway, in an army whose liaison officers filed reports on exactly this kind of operation, and whose generals read them. Distance and ignorance were never quite the same thing. From the middle of 1942, Dostler's career took him somewhere quieter. He was given command of the 163rd Infantry Division, fighting alongside Finnish forces on the northern edge of the Eastern Front, and he stayed there through most of the war, until German troops finally withdrew from Finland into Norway in the autumn of 1944. On the 1st of January 1943, he was promoted again to General Lieutenant, Major General, a rank that put him firmly among the senior leadership of the German army. It's worth sitting with that for a second. While the war around him was collapsing into some of its darkest chapters, Dostler's career simply kept climbing. By January of 1944, the climb had brought him to Italy in command of the newly formed 75th Army Corps. Italy by this point was a country in chaos. It had surrendered to the Allies the previous September, and Germany had responded by occupying the north of the country outright, propping up a puppet fascist government under Mussolini in the town of Salo. Dostler's corps was handed responsibility for defending the Ligurian coastline, fortifications, anti-partisan operations, and the quiet, unglamorous work of holding a crumbling front together. It's an unremarkable assignment, on paper. It's also the assignment that would end his life. Because in March of 1944, 15 young Americans were about to land on that coastline, and Anton Dossler was about to make the decision that defined the rest of his story. On the night of March 22, 1944, 15 soldiers of the United States Army came ashore on the Italian coast, about 15 kilometers north of the port city of La Spezia, roughly 250 miles behind the established front line. This was Operation Ginny II, a sabotage mission with a single, specific target, a railway tunnel at Fermura, part of the vital line connecting La Spezia to Genoa. Cut that line, and you cut a major artery of German supply and movement along the coast. Here's the detail that matters more than almost any other in the story. Every one of those 15 men was wearing a proper United States Army field uniform. Not disguises, not civilian clothes, nothing that could be mistaken for anything other than exactly what they were. Uniformed soldiers of a nation Germany was at war with, on a military mission behind enemy lines. Under the laws of war at the time, that single fact should have settled everything about how they were to be treated if captured. They never reached the tunnel. 2 days after landing, the group was caught by a combined force of Italian fascist troops and German soldiers and marched to La Spezia, where they were held near the headquarters of the 135th Fortress Brigade, under the command of a German colonel named Kurt Almers. Almers answered directly to the commander of the 75th Army Corps, Anton Dossler. What happened over the following 48 hours is documented in unusual detail because it would later be reconstructed piece by piece in a courtroom. Wehrmacht intelligence officers interrogated the captured Americans and learned exactly what their mission had been: a commando raid, not an act of espionage, not sabotage in disguise. That information went straight to Dostler at his Corps headquarters. And Dostler did something that, on its own, looks almost procedurally correct. He passed the information up the chain to his superior, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of all German forces in Italy, and asked what should be done with the prisoners. According to Dostler's own adjutant, Kesselring's answer came back quickly: execute them. That order rested on something called the Commando Order, issued personally by Hitler in 1942, a standing directive that any Allied commando captured in Europe, in uniform or not, surrendering or not, was to be shot immediately, without trial. It was, by any legal standard that existed at the time, an illegal order. And Dostler, rather than questioning it, relayed it. he sent a telegram to Colonel Almers at the 135th Fortress Brigade, instructing him to carry out the execution. Almers hesitated. He understood, in a way his commanding officer apparently didn't or didn't care to, that shooting uniformed prisoners of war violated the Geneva Convention of 1929, a treaty Germany had signed. He went back to Dostler, tried to buy time, asked whether the order could be delayed or reconsidered. Dostler's response was to send a second telegram, repeating the instruction. Almers tried again, by telephone this time, a direct personal appeal to stop what was about to happen. It didn't work. On the morning of March 26, 1944, the 15 Americans were led out to a stretch of coastline called Punta Bianca, south of La Spezia. What followed wasn't an execution in any procedural sense. It was closer to a massacre. All 15 men were shot. Their bodies were buried afterward in a mass grave, deliberately camouflaged to hide what had happened. One officer on Dostler's own staff, a man who apparently hadn't been told about the commando order at all, refused outright to sign off on the killings. He was dismissed from the Wehrmacht for insubordination, the only immediate consequence anyone faced for what happened at Punta Bianca. And then, nothing. Anton Dossler went back to his command as though the previous week hadn't happened. There was no inquiry, no reprimand, no hesitation from his superiors. 8 months later, in November of 1944, he was simply reassigned to another corps and continued serving until the war's end, a decorated general with 15 dead Americans buried in an unmarked grave behind him, and for the moment, absolutely no reason to think anyone would ever ask him to answer for it. He was wrong. When the war ended, in May of 1945, American forces began piecing together what had happened to the Operation Ginny the Toon team, and it didn't take long for the trail to lead to Dostler. He was captured and held as a prisoner of war, and unlike the 15 men he'd ordered killed without any legal process at all, Dostler was about to get exactly what he'd denied them: a trial. On the 8th of October 1945, a military tribunal convened at the Royal Palace in Caserta, Italy, the wartime seat of the Supreme Allied Commander in the Mediterranean. It was, by every meaningful definition, the first Allied war crimes trial of the Second World War, weeks before the far more famous proceedings would open at Nuremberg. Dostler sat in the dock facing a single, specific charge, ordering the illegal execution of 15 American prisoners of war. His defense was simple, and it's the same defense that would become infamous over the following months as more senior Nazi officials stood trial for far larger crimes. Dostler argued that he hadn't personally decided to kill anyone. He'd simply passed along an order from Field Marshal Kesselring, a superior officer, giving a lawful command in wartime. Under that logic, the responsibility belonged further up the chain, not with him. The tribunal didn't buy it. Judges found that in issuing and enforcing that execution order, Dostler had acted on his own initiative in ways that went beyond what even Hitler's own directive required. And, more importantly, that no rank, no chain of command, and no claim of just following orders could excuse what had happened. The killing of the 15 Americans was a direct violation of Article 2 of the 1929 Geneva Convention, which explicitly prohibited reprisals against prisoners of war. It also violated the 1907 Hague Convention, which drew a hard legal line between saboteurs disguised as civilians, who could, under the laws of the time, be treated as spies, and soldiers captured in their own uniform, who were entitled to be treated as prisoners of war, full stop. The 15 men at Punta Bianca had never been in disguise. They had been exactly who their uniforms said they were, and Dostler had known it. The tribunal's ruling put it in words that are worth hearing almost exactly as they were written: that no soldier, and least of all a commanding general, could claim that summarily shooting prisoners of war was legitimate, even as an act of reprisal. It's a short line, but it did enormous legal work. In rejecting Dostler's defense, this tribunal set a precedent that would matter far beyond one Italian courtroom. Because a few weeks later, at Nuremberg, dozens of far more powerful men would try exactly the same argument. They would say they were only following orders, and thanks in part to what happened at Caserta, that defense would never again be enough on its own to walk a man free. So here's the question worth sitting with. Dostler didn't invent the order that killed those 15 Americans. Hitler did, and Kesselring passed it down to him. All Dostler did, by his own account, was relay it 2 more times and refuse to listen when a subordinate begged him to stop. Is that enough to make him a murderer? Or is that exactly the point, that somewhere in every chain of command, someone has to be the person who refuses to pass the order along? And Dostler simply wasn't that person? We want to know where you land. Tell us in the comments. On the 12th of October, 1945, the tribunal delivered its verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence was death, to be carried out by firing squad. Dostler was 54 years old on the morning of December the 1st, 1945, when he was brought from his cell to a prisoner stockade in the Italian town of Aversa. The proceedings were read aloud to him one final time: the charge, the finding, the sentence, and he was given a brief moment with a Roman Catholic chaplain before it began. Then it moved quickly, the way these things were designed to move. 3 soldiers bound him to a wooden post. his hands tied behind his back. A medical officer stepped forward and placed a black hood over his head, then pinned a small white target, 4 inches across, directly over his heart. 12 riflemen took their positions 50 feet away. At 8 o'clock in the morning, on the order of the officer in charge, they fired in unison. Anton Dossler's body slumped forward against the ropes. Army photographers and a film crew were there to record all of it, on both still cameras and motion picture film. A piece of visual history that still exists today, one of the only executions of a German general captured on camera in this much detail. Afterward, his body was placed on a stretcher, wrapped in a plain white cotton shroud and driven away by truck. He was buried in the German war cemetery at Pomezia, outside Rome, a single grave among tens of thousands of other German war dead. No different in death from any ordinary soldier, despite everything that had set him apart in life. Field Marshal Kesselring, the man who gave the original order that started all of this, was tried separately, sentenced to death himself, and then had that sentence commuted and was released from prison within a decade. A reminder that, in the messy business of post-war justice, the chain of command didn't always end where the ropes and rifles did. It's worth noticing what didn't happen at that execution. There was no dramatic confession, no last statement of remorse recorded for history, no moment where Dostler seemed to reckon publicly with what he'd done. By every account that survives, he went to his death still believing, on some level, that he'd been the wrong man to pay for someone else's order. History, and the tribunal that convicted him, disagreed. For decades after the war, a comforting myth took hold in Germany and beyond, that the regular army, the Wehrmacht, had simply fought a conventional war, following honorable rules of engagement, while the real atrocities belonged entirely to the SS. That myth started almost immediately at Nuremberg itself, where the SS was formally declared a criminal organization, and the broader German military was not. Only the very top of the military high command ever faced serious legal reckoning. For everyone below that level, men like Dostler and thousands of officers like him, there was, for a long time, no reckoning at all. Decades of research since have picked that myth apart. The evidence is overwhelming, and it isn't subtle. The German military didn't stand apart from the machinery of Nazi atrocity, it was part of it. From the logistics behind the Einsatzgruppen's massacres, to the forced labor camps, to men exactly like Anton Dossler, willing to relay an illegal execution order twice over rather than risk his own career by questioning it. Dostler was, in the end, one of the very few senior German officers who paid for that willingness with his own life. And he paid early, months before Nuremberg had even opened its doors, in a trial most people have never heard of, over a crime involving 15 men whose names rarely make it into the history books. 15 young Americans who did their job, wore their uniforms honestly, and were murdered for it anyway. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the trials the textbooks skip, the men who thought a chain of command could shield them, and the moments justice actually caught up with someone, this is exactly what this channel exists to dig up. Subscribe if you want to be here for the next